Everybody, right? So welcome everybody. We're just a few days after Yom Ha'atzmaut. So I thought that we would devote some time to talk about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Essentially the question, is living in Israel today a mitzvah? I want to dedicate today's shiur to a very heroic dog named Django. We all heard, hopefully, about took some time, but thank God the security forces, the army, was able to locate and liquidate the terrorists who murdered the D family. And no surprise that they were caught in the Avi Avot HaTuma, the worst place for terrorism, the source of terrorism in the Middle East, at least our part of the Middle East, and that is in the Kasbah in Shechem. And one of the heroes of that mission was a specially trained dog by the Oketz unit. And Django, who had actually participated in many, many dangerous missions, was killed by the terrorists, but helped to locate them and ultimately lead to their assassination, I guess we can call it. So it's actually a very touching thing. The units are very, very much attached to the dogs that they train for years, and they do serve a very, very important part in these missions of the IDF. So we're going to talk about living in Israel and the mitzvah, or is it a mitzvah? And of course, it's kind of, for all of us who do live here already, it's kind of silly to ask, is living here a mitzvah? But we should try to understand the source of our connection to this land. And we have to also explore the flip side, because if indeed it is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, why are there not more Jews here, including rabbinic leaders who you would think would come here and fulfill the mitzvah if it is a mitzvah? In fact, many of these, Rav Soloveitchik, for example, or the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they're not even buried here. Some of the rabbinic leaders do come here to get buried, but many or most of them do not. And we have to ask, well, what's going on? If indeed it is a mitzvah to live here, they should be the first ones to come. And I would venture to say that when I came to Israel, and even since, there's probably less than a dozen rabbis, American rabbis, who came to Israel in the midst of their career. Almost all of the American rabbis you read about in Israel, they've all come after they've retired and essentially come here to live out their golden years, so to speak. Some of them do contribute and do get involved, but many of them are already in their 80s or older, and they come here not really taking a congregation, etc. And it's an oft-asked question. They, you would think, would be the leaders in convincing people to come to Israel and coming to Israel. We have a little time at the end to talk about it, I think, and get some of your own, everybody's opinion on this subject. But we're going to start with understanding the halachic side of the issue first. The Ramban, who is one of the Nachmanides, who's one of the most outspoken proponents of the mitzvah of living in Israel, in quoting the pasuk, it's found in a number of places. He initially quotes the pasuk in Parshat Maseh, the journeys, it's an appropriate parsha, the journeys of the Jewish people, a very short pasuk that says, "V'horashtem et haaretz v'shaptem ba," you shall inherit the land and you shall live there. Someone to another place it says, "V'horashtem otam," and therefore the words "v'horashtem" could mean inherit, but it can also mean disinherit. That is, you take over the land that somebody else may be living in it at the time, and you will live there. And so the Ramban says it's actually a two-part mitzvah that applies to every Jew in every generation, not just to Yeshua or those who lived in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, but it applies to every single Jew. And it's two parts. The first is take control of the land if possible, gain sovereignty over Israel. And the second part is to live here in Israel, even if it's under foreign domination, and even if the Jewish people do not have sovereignty over it, nevertheless, you fulfill a mitzvah by living here. And the Ramban is very, very charif. He's very strong in his statement about this being absolutely one of the biblical commandments, mitzvah d'oraita. The Rambam, on the other hand, Maimonides, although he never says that it is not a mitzvah to live here, he's essentially silent on the issue. He does not list the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, to dwell in the land of Israel, in his classic Sefer HaMitzvot, where he lists all of the commandments he believes are in the Torah. There are a number of these Sfarim, by the way, because it's hard to distinguish what is and is not a mitzvah. We have a statement in the Gemara that there are 613 commandments, but it's never authoritatively listed. And so different individuals are going to give their idea of what they feel constitutes a mitzvah. Some of them are many mitzvot within one. Some of them are repeated. The Rambam doesn't repeat mitzvot. And once it's given, that it's a one-time thing. And the Rambam does not list living in Israel. A minority of commentators say this is because the Maimonides may not have felt that this mitzvah is applicable today, and perhaps thinking that it only applies when Moshiach comes. However, most of the commentators do not agree with that, and most of them explain the Rambam in a number of different ways. Some say that living in Israel is such a fundamental mitzvah, and later on I'll give you a quote about this, that it is a mitzvah like loving God, for example, that it is assumed. It's a foundational mitzvah that doesn't have to be specifically listed. We just know that this is where Jews should be living. The Rambam also lists the bringing of karbanot as biblical mitzvot. And if it's a biblical mitzvah to bring a karban, obviously you're bringing that karban in the Beit HaMikdash, in Yerushalayim, and you have to be living here in order to do that. So they would say that the Rambam understood that many of the mitzvot in the Torah automatically assume life in Israel. The Rambam and many would counter on his behalf to say that you can't say that this will become a mitzvah when Moshiach comes, because one of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith is that you cannot add any new mitzvah to the Torah, including when Moshiach comes. That there may be some mitzvot that are perhaps no longer functionable, maybe when Moshiach comes. That's another story. But you can't add a mitzvah. So for somebody to say it's not a mitzvah now, but it will be when Moshiach comes, no. The Rambam would reject that. However, so that debate continues, and there are some people that want to say, well, let's just ignore the Ramban, who is great in his own right, one of the greatest of all the sages. Let's just ignore what the Ramban says and extrapolate from the Rambam's leaving out this mitzvah in his book, in his list. Maybe that means it really isn't a mitzvah. Okay, well, that's a bit of a stretch. However, the Gemara does say that there are exemptions from this mitzvah, and essentially 4 reasons, legitimate reasons why a person would not fulfill the mitzvah of living in Israel. The first is the concept of danger, that it's a dangerous place to live and you don't have to place yourself in danger. I'll come back to this. The second is the inability to make a living for parnasah. If you need to make a living and you can't do it here, then you have a rationale that you can either not come to Israel or leave Israel to make a living. Third, that if there are no eligible matches for marriage, if you can't find someone to marry here, then you can go elsewhere, because it's fundamental for a person to be married and have children, etc. And the fourth reason given is that there are no opportunities for Torah learning. So I think we see right off the bat that 3 of these 4 clearly are not applicable today. You can certainly make a living. You certainly can learn Torah. More people are learning Torah here than in any other time in history. And I think it's certainly possible to, meet your bashert here in Israel. If you have that specific issue where you meet somebody and they're currently living outside of Israel, okay. But to say that I have to leave Israel because there are no eligible men or women, well, obviously that's a stretch. And on the issue of danger, so the Minchat Chinuch comments and says that any mitzvah that has danger woven into it cannot be exempted by pikuach nefesh. That is, there are certain mitzvot that have an inherent danger. Let's say, for example, there is a mitzvah to travel, to come to Yerushalayim on the Shalosh Regalim. And you don't know what's going to happen along the way. It's a long trip coming from Tveria or coming, maybe from Beersheba. But nevertheless, and you might say, well, it might be dangerous. Okay, that doesn't mean that the mitzvah doesn't exist. And certainly we know that when we conquered Israel, when we fought for Israel, for all the years that we controlled Israel, there is an inherent danger there. And nevertheless, it's a mitzvah to defend the land. So you can't count that as a reason. You do have to take precautions in order to protect yourself. But to say that it's more dangerous to live in Israel, I think is also maybe just kind of closing your eyes to what's happening worldwide. When you look at today, for example, the crime in America is just absolutely, at heights or depths that haven't been seen maybe ever. And we know that Israel has issues, but not really crime. You can walk the streets of Israel in almost all the cities, and it's essentially a safe place. And therefore, we wouldn't consider that an exemption today. Many people point to the issue of family and say, well, I can't live in Israel because my family is outside of Israel. I have to take care of my family. And maybe I have a family business. There are all kinds of issues with family. And I think some of those issues may be legitimate. The only thing I would say to somebody who says that I need to stay near my family, I need to take this job, etc. But if you were to say to that same person, would you move to Japan or New Zealand if you found a job for $500,000 a year? And most people would say, yeah, for that kind of salary, I would leave my family and I would move to Japan or move to Australia, et cetera. So then basically what you have to decide is, what is Israel worth? Is it the equivalent of $500,000, $250,000? If you're willing to leave your family for that, then you have to consider whether that's not really a legitimate excuse for not being here. Another possibility that some suggest as a legitimate reason is the need to help others who are living in Chutz La'aretz. And this is especially true it's true in a lot of different capacities. It might be in the medical field, it might be communal leaders, it might be spiritual leaders. In the famous discussion, let's call it, between the Rebbe and Menachem Begin, because Menachem Begin came to New York and he went to see Rav Schneerson, and he appealed to him to come to Israel. The Rebbe never actually set foot in Israel. His predecessors did, but he did not ever come to Israel. And Menachem Begin asked him in a very polite way, we need you, come to Israel. And the Rebbe gave a classic answer, and he said, the place of the physician is with the sick. And therefore, he said, I need to be here. Now, obviously, if you look a little deeper, he, even at that time, viewed American Jewry as, quote unquote, unhealthy, let's call it that. And you'd have to consider, what would he say if he were alive today? about the situation in America. But these are all reasons that people have given. And you might have to judge for yourself which, if any, are legitimate. There is a very famous, it's really more of a side comment, I think, that is used by some in the Haredi world. It was used specifically by the Satmar Rebbe, who said that who of course did not accept the legitimacy of the Zionist state in general, but he quoted this famous section of the Gemara of Ketubot on what's called the three oaths, the three promises. And there the Gemara says that God conducted three oaths. He swore the Jewish people, number one, not to take Israel, of course, this is after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, not to take Israel back by force, number one. Secondly, made them swear not to rebel against the nations of the world. And then he made the nations swear that they would not persecute the Jews too much. And says the Satmar Rebbe, therefore, it seems that there's no justification to come to Israel before the Moshiach comes. Now, this has been attacked from many, many directions by many different sources and rabbis. Number one, there are those who say this is not halacha. This is what we call agadata. This is, just statements that are made, stories that are told, things that are not halachically based, but it's more or less of a story, and it's not binding. Secondly, many people came out and said that even if there was some justification to these oaths, once there was agreement on a global level that the Jews would come back to Israel, whether it's the Balfour Declaration, the partition plan, the vote of the UN, here you see that we're not taking Israel by force, that the world is voting and saying, no, you're welcome to come back and take this land. It's true we had to fight, but that was against a minority. The majority of the world nations, as we know in the vote at the UN, accepted the fact that there will be and Israel will come back and return to our homeland. The second idea as well is that the nations also had their oath to keep, and that is that they would not overly persecute the Jewish people. Well, the Holocaust made that very clear, that the nations were not doing their part of the bargain. And so therefore, in these years following the Shoah, no one could say that these oaths held any sway whatsoever. So on a halachic level, I think we see that almost all of the authorities are pointing to Israel as being, at the very least, a fulfillment of a biblical mitzvah if you come here. The Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked the question. He gave a very unusual answer. And he said that living in Israel is absolutely a mitzvah, but it is what he called a mitzvah kiyumi, not a mitzvah chiyuvi. Now, I will say, first of all, he's the only authority that seems to make this statement, which says that living in Israel is like wearing tzitzit. Tzitzit are required if you have a four-cornered garment, even though later on we adopted the minhag of wearing that four-cornered garment anyway. But he said it's only a mitzvah if you're wearing a four-cornered garment. If you do it then, fine, you fulfill a mitzvah. If you don't wear a four-cornered garment, no, then you don't require mitzvot, tzitzit, to be attached to it. So he's saying that Israel, it's like tzitzit. If you do it, you definitely fulfill a mitzvah. But if you don't do it, then, well, you don't have an absolute requirement to pick up and come to Israel. Now, many people disagreed with this idea, but even if you do accept that, so you're still saying that it is a mitzvah to live in Israel. And why would you not want to do a mitzvah? Moshe Rabbeinu, who fought in every possible way to gain entrance to Eretz Yisrael, one of the reasons, the classic reason that's given, is not that he necessarily wanted to continue and be a leader and see the mission through to the end to enter Israel, but that there were mitzvot that could only be kept in Israel. He wanted to keep as many mitzvot as possible. Mitzvot Tliot Baaretz can only be done in Israel. So he wanted to do that as well. So you can ask, why would somebody not want to do a mitzvah? And why would they, if you coming in Israel and we say that, every dalet amot that you walk is a mitzvah, kum hitalech ba'aretz, there are all kinds of quotes. So even if you accepted that it was an optional mitzvah, still a mitzvah. But beyond the halacha, I think we have to try to look at a little broader at our own worldview and understand the progression of Jewish history. Hashem created us. He ultimately took us out of Israel. He gave us a Torah. He gave us a land. And although we lost that land twice, clearly all of the Tanakh, and you can see hundreds of quotes that says we are incomplete without the Beit HaMikdash, without living in Israel. And that's something, of course, that has been part and parcel of being a Jew, and certainly the end game of Jewish history. So we live in a generation where God had a door, that God has opened a door for us, so to speak, in giving us this blessing of Israel. And it's incomprehensible that we shouldn't walk through that door. He gives us this precious gift, and we refuse it. We just simply disdain. 70% of the Jews of America have never been to Israel. Although many come, they come over and over again, but 70% have never set foot in Israel. We prayed for this every day for 2,000 years, fervently, many different tefillot, talking about coming back to Israel. But now that our prayers have been answered, we're not going to act on it. Were our prayers sincere, or were they really just lip service? We got what we prayed for, and now we're not really doing anything with it. Beyond that, I think, and I think this certainly applies to anybody who chose to live here, we ask and we feel, where will Jewish history be decided? That this is the place. It's only here where that the arrow of history is pointing. And that is why the entire world is obsessed with Israel. In a sense, they understand its importance, and sometimes we don't. And that's why they're fixated on everything that goes on in Israel. It's under a magnifying glass every single moment to track everything that we do, because they understand that this is a monumental occurrence that is unprecedented in history. We also might ask, why would we want to prolong the exile? Now, people don't like to call living in certain countries galut, an exile. So they invented a word, diaspora, but diaspora is not the true word. We call people living outside of Israel, we call that the galut. We say in our davening 3 times a year, because of our sins, we were exiled. In other words, exile was a punishment. Exile is not something that we sought to have, that we wanted to have, that is an ideal existence. So in a sense, we're prolonging the punishment. We're somewhat like the slave, the Hebrew slave that works for 6 years, and then he refuses to go free. And he says, no, I like it here. I want to stay here. Well, we look upon him and we say, you're in denial, really. And what do? We put a hole in the ear of the slave as an indication that says, you're not listening. You didn't hear what God said, and therefore your hearing is defective. And that's, again, it seems like we're identifying with the slave that would not leave, that, in most cases, slaves stole, they couldn't pay back the debt, so they had to be sold into slavery, but it's a punishment. It's not something that you want to do ideally. And it begs the question that says, when we were in exile, yes, so that was ordained by God. We had to go into exile, and in a sense, God went there with us. But when we return and we leave the exile, we leave Galut, and we come back to Israel, God comes back with us. And that is a very scary, frightening thing to think that although God is everywhere, in a sense, the presence of God has returned to its true home. And that may certainly not bode well for those who are living outside of Israel. Just a couple of quotes, and then I'll see if anybody wants to add anything. And there are any number of quotes that tell us about the importance of Israel. One of the most powerful says that the person who lives outside of Israel, it is as if he has no God. And no matter what you're experiencing in Israel, outside of Israel, it doesn't really matter, because God's plan is for us to return. Why? If you're not following that, then in a sense, you've rejected God. We have another statement that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael Shekula Keneged Kol HaTorah Kula, that living in Israel is equal to all the other mitzvot in the Torah. Now, what does that mean? Because there are, you're saying that the other 612 mitzvot are not important? No, it's saying that there are certain fundamental mitzvot that this quote is associated with. One is living in Israel, another is Shabbat. Shabbat is equal to all the rest of the Torah. Another one is Brit Milah. These are fundamental mitzvot that, while all mitzvot are important, these are the central mitzvot that identify you as a Jew. And if you reject the concept of Israel, then, you may be making a statement that I'm not really a Jew. We say in Parshat Ekev, which is my own bar mitzvah parsha, Parshat Eretz Yisrael, Einei Hashem Elokecha ba, that the eyes of God are on Israel from the beginning of the year till the end. That God has a special relationship with Israel that doesn't exist anywhere else. And so I think that the ultimate ideology is simply to say, we're not coming here because we're forced to or commanded to. We're coming here because we recognize that we live in a miraculous time, that something that most Jews dreamed of and maybe never even dreamed could be possible has come true. We have our issues, we have our problems. That's not anything unique. And remember that the other times when we lived in Israel also were filled with all kinds of problems. And that's why the two Batei Mikdash were destroyed, and they were far from ideal communities. So we certainly have work to do, but nevertheless, every day that we're here is Nisecha Shebachol Yom Imanu, and clearly this is where we're meant to be, with the belief that we're not going anywhere. We're staying here, and that one way or another, hopefully benevolently, but if not by force, events will transpire in the world that the Jewish people will have to return here. And we certainly don't want to see that happen in a negative way, but in a positive way. And for those people who are already here, certainly you already recognize that, and you should be commended. And hopefully the rest of the world, the rest of the Jewish people will get the message. I would say it seems fairly clear that the majority of Jews in the world already live here. If we define Jew, who is a Jew halachically, and I think no matter how you define a Jew, everybody agrees that it's only a matter of a few short years when clearly more than 50% of the world Jewish population will be living here in Israel. So I will pause, and I'll ask Tal if she can, you can unmute yourself, hopefully, and if anybody wants to make a comment. I know some people have been putting messages in the chat, and they're all good messages. As I think Yehudit said, when people say, I could never live here, do they think that God made a mistake and did not create a land good enough to support us? And, that's exactly what we were saying before, that most of these reasons for not coming, when you really examine them, they're pretty flimsy excuses. So if anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question, we can take a moment and do that. If you want to unmute. Yes, Rochelle.
Hi, thanks. I know I came in late. I didn't get home till now. Did you raise the topic of Mashiach needing to bring everybody to Israel? Because that's an issue that existed for my mom during the Holocaust. The Sochnut had sent somebody over to try and rescue the children and actually walk by foot from the Carpathian area, Carpathian Mountains, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, over to Israel. And my Savta, she basically said, no way, like literally over my dead body. We have to wait for Mashiach to come. She'd been raised in a Satmar home, and it never happened. Of course, my mom went to concentration camp along with the rest of the family.
Well, we did talk about that, and we said that there are some people who want to take that position. I think it's more or less of for most of them, it's just a handy excuse to say, I'm not coming. The truth is that there are many authorities who say that the opposite, you have to look at it in the opposite way, that if you want Moshiach to come, you will come back and live in Israel. And when the majority of Jews are living in Israel, that will automatically bring the Moshiach, and that will create the environment that is ideal for Moshiach to come. So I think that's how we would probably look at it. And Moshiach is waiting for us, not we're waiting for Moshiach. He's waiting for us. Any other comments or questions that anybody wants to ask?
Yeah, but aren't there a lot of Haredim that don't believe that they should be in Israel until Moshiach comes?
Again, there are. The question is whether or not they're using that as an excuse, or whether or not that's a true philosophical halachic belief. We seem to have rejected that idea that you have to wait for Moshiach. The Satmar held it, but I think that was based more on an anti-Zionist posture that he was taking, because as we know, there are hundreds of thousands of Hasidim and Haredim that live in Israel. And obviously they have rejected that idea. So there may be a few people that have that, but all they have to do is look at the numbers and see as I said, the hundreds of thousands of Haredim and Hasidim who already live here and believe strongly that this is a mitzvah to live here. Yeah. Any other comments that anybody wants to make? But again, the idea of Moshiach is a very not just complex, but a very pretty much ethereal idea. We don't really, we talk about it, but we don't really define exactly who Moshiach is or what is going to bring Moshiach. And again, many people hold that what will bring Moshiach is when the Jewish people come and live in Israel as a majority, and that is what will set the stage for Moshiach coming. And not living in Israel is actually holding Moshiach back from coming. But okay, that's a matter of debate. And people have to examine their own conscience, why they would use that as a reason not to live here. And just to say that it's certainly not a Hasidic belief or a Haredi belief, because you see hundreds of thousands of them who are here. Anyone else wants to? It's an issue that I think everybody has an opinion on.
Rabbi Weiss.
Yes, Yehudit.
Well done.
Yes, I should have yelled.
You have to say it over and over and over again. This is the land of the Jews. This is what Hashem prepared for us. And anything else, there's a minority that can't come. It's an excuse. You have to come here to live. It's a mitzvah, like kashrus, like Shabbos. You don't think for a minute that you're not going to keep Shabbos. I don't know why people think they don't live here.
Right. Thank you. You're right. I want to just address what Marissa said, and that is, what about the anti-Israel Jews who live in America or elsewhere? Well, I would say that for most of those people, in my humble and cynical opinion, is that they're taking that stance to justify or rationalize their not being here, and therefore they're stepping up and saying, well, you know, Israel is
Lives here.
terrible.
And we go to
Israel. Hi, remember you're unmuted, people, Charlotte. Okay. So a lot of those people are using that as an excuse for a decision they've already made not to come to Israel. We do have our faults. And obviously there's a tremendous anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism, which is turning a lot of people away from Israel. And, you know, it's a mob mentality. It's especially on campus. It's very easy to brainwash people. And there are people that unfortunately are being fed a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionistic garbage, and they're swallowing it and they're believing in it. Nobody says Israel's perfect. We have our issues, but I think we have the most moral army in the world. We have every justification for being here. And these people, many of them, when they actually do come to Israel, think differently. And that's why birthright has been a big bracha, in my opinion, because by bringing young people here, even though we're paying for them to come, they do get an on-site view of Israel that really has a positive effect on them. I know them because one of them is my son-in-law who came on birthright and who loved Israel and who decided he was coming back to Israel, becoming religious, and he did so, Baruch Hashem. And he's one of many who've gone through that experience. So there is hope, but we indeed, it's very, very tragic and depressing, frustrating to see fellow Jews who are taking a stance against Israel, usually out of ignorance. And much of the attacks on Israel, it's all based on ignorance, people who don't even know where Israel is, where Palestine is. They can't find it on a map. All they do is mouth the same. You know, it's interesting. Yeah, I think yesterday the French parliament voted officially Israel is not an apartheid state. We didn't need France to tell us that, but, you know, I think it was a good thing that they did, because a lot of these people are just being fed this lie that Israel is apartheid, no matter, you know, how many Arabs are voting or going to schools, et cetera, and actually living a much better life than anywhere, pretty much anywhere else, at least in the regional Middle East. So, you know, people are unfortunately not in touch with the reality and the facts of what's going on here. But if they do come, usually most of them have a very different opinion. Any other comment?
Yeah, I think it's an important thing that they say that assimilation is such a huge problem in Chutz La'aretz these days.
You're
it's
absolutely,
so important for
yes, you're right.
For Yehudim to be here.
You're right. Part of assimilation is the connection to Israel, no question, because you know, the true connection to Israel is a religious connection. Yes, there is a cultural association, and yes, you know, there is a popular idea of supporting Israel, but at its heart, it is a religious conviction. And that's why if you don't have that religious baseline, unfortunately, even if you live in Israel and even if you are in the government and even if you're the prime minister of the country and you don't have a religious background, then you see what has happened in the past where people can really change and go from, you know, feeling very strongly about populating Israel and about Yehuda and Shomron, and suddenly they change because it is a they need a religious baseline. It is first and foremost a religious foundation to come to Israel, to believe in Israel. And even if you're not religious, you recognize that this is a godly place to live and you are fulfilling a mitzvah when you're here. And that is a very important part of being here. And sometimes, as I think Yehudi told us on the very first day we arrived, when all else fails, tell yourself, you're fulfilling a mitzvah, you're doing a mitzvah. And that's got to be worth something with all the difficulty that living here can bring. Any other questions or comments? Okay, we'll be back, God willing, next week, same time, same place. And thanks to everybody for joining us. And Am Yisrael Chai. Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.